This is I, the creator of all the ungoverning, ruthless forces of nature which are not subject to any ethical laws. I too am an immoral force of nature, a purely phenomenal personality which cannot see its own back. There is perhaps no figure in human consciousness more vast, mysterious, and paradoxical than God, a presence that transcends time, culture, and beliefs. From the silent architect of the cosmos to the intimate voice in the human heart, the idea of God has guided civilizations, inspired awe, and provoked endless contemplation across religions and philosophies. This figure embodies the ultimate source of meaning, order, and being. In Christianity, God is the Alpha and the Omega, infinite love, but also righteous wrath. In Islam, Allah is both merciful and just, closer to man than his own jugular vein, yet utterly beyond comprehension. In Hinduism, Brahman is the supreme reality, both immanent and transcendent, manifesting as the many faces of divinity. According to the old tradition, the creator of the world, the Demi Urgos, was a blind demon who thought he had made human beings as unconscious as possible, in order that they should not see the imperfection. But the God of the spiritual world was quite different. He never made material creations, because that was beneath his dignity. Only demons could work with dirt. So when he saw the mystery of those blind human beings, Adam and Eve, he sent his son in the form of the serpent in paradise, to tell them they ought to change, they ought to eat the forbidden fruit, in order to become conscious and see the difference between good and bad, knowing good and evil, as the text says. So the Son of God made his first appearance on earth in the form of the snake in paradise, giving good advice to the first parents. While this may be a mere myth to some, it doesn't interfere with the fact that Yahweh was, and perhaps still is, a maniac. No matter what arguments are made, no matter how many theologies are constructed, or how many billions of pages have been written and will be written, regardless of what you believe, what your parents taught you, or what you're inclined to say, do, or think, one thing is difficult to deny: God, as portrayed in Scripture, appears psychologically unstable. He commands genocides, drowns the world in a flood, reduces cities to ash, and inflicts suffering on entire nations, all in the name of obedience. He wants us to become dependable puppets, even though he didn't create us as such. He demands absolute obedience and punishes those who question or resist, not with correction but with annihilation. These are not the traits of a loving father. These are the shadows of a God image distorted, a reflection of the unconscious mind projected onto the heavens. From the very beginning, the Bible paints a portrait of Yahweh that, if stripped of theological reverence, reveals a deity of staggering cruelty, arbitrary violence, and psychological instability. A being whose actions would be condemned as monstrous if performed by any human ruler. This is not a God of love, not a God of justice, but a God of raw, unchecked power, who demands absolute submission while exhibiting none of the moral consistency he demands from his creations. Consider the opening act of the biblical drama, where it all began, the story of Adam and Eve. Here we witness what psychologists would recognize as a classic case of narcissistic parenting. The Divine Father creates children in his own image and likeness, yet immediately establishes conditions designed to ensure failure, a sin only possible because Yahweh placed the tree of knowledge within reach, then forbade it without explanation. The tree of knowledge then stands as a psychological trap, a test where curiosity, the very trait that defines human consciousness, becomes a capital offense. This isn't wisdom, it's manufactured dependency. The healthy parent encourages growth, exploration, and eventual independence. The narcissistic parent creates double binds. I've given you free will, but you must never use it. The punishment for this inevitable transgression reveals the first glimpse of divine sadism: exile, suffering, and death. Not just for Adam and Eve, but for every human who would ever exist. Collective punishment for a single act of curiosity. Is this justice, or is this the caprice of a deity who rules by fear? The pattern only worsens. Cain kills Abel, and though Yahweh could intervene, he doesn't. Instead, he allows the first murder to happen, then brands Cain a wanderer, another disproportionate punishment. But the true horror comes with the flood. Yahweh, in his infinite wisdom, decides that humanity is too wicked to exist. Never mind that he created them. Never mind that he designed their nature, his solution is genocide. Not a targeted purge of the wicked, but the drowning of every living thing, men and children, infants, animals. Billions of creatures gasping for air as the waters rise, their lungs burning, their bodies crushed by the weight of divine wrath. And for what? Because Yahweh regretted his own creation. An all-knowing God who didn't foresee the corruption of his own design is either not all-knowing or deliberately cruel. Either way, this is not a God worthy of worship. This is a cosmic child smashing his toys in a fit of rage. After the flood, Yahweh makes a covenant with Noah, promising never to drown the world again. But this is no mercy, it's a loophole. He doesn't promise to stop killing, he only promises to stop killing this way. And true to form, the destruction continues. Sodom and Gomorrah are incinerated, not for their crimes alone, but as a spectacle, a warning to others. Abraham begs Yahweh to spare the cities if even 10 righteous people can be found. But Yahweh doesn't wait to find out. He burns them all. Children, servants, the innocent, all reduced to ash because their neighbors were sinful. This is not justice. This is collective punishment on a scale that would make the worst dictators blush. Then comes Abraham's greatest test, the near sacrifice of Isaac. Yahweh commands a father to murder his own son to prove his loyalty. Only at the last second does he relent. But the message is clear. Yahweh demands absolute, mindless obedience, even at the cost of morality itself. A God who tests faith through child sacrifice is not holy, he is a sadist. And this pattern repeats throughout Scripture. In Exodus, Yahweh hardens Pharaoh's heart, deliberately preventing him from freeing the Israelites, just so he can unleash plagues after plagues upon Egypt. The final plague? The murder of every firstborn child. Imagine the screams in the night as parents clutched their lifeless sons, all because Yahweh wanted to make a point. This is not liberation, this is terrorism. A God who slaughters children to prove his power is not a savior, he is a monster. And what of the Israelites he saves? He leads them into the wilderness, only to starve them, test them, and then slaughter them when they complain. When Moses begs to see Yahweh's glory, Yahweh responds by declaring that no one can see his face and live. Why? Because his true nature is too horrifying to behold. At Sinai, he threatens death to anyone who touches the mountain. When the people worship the golden calf, he orders the Levites to slaughter their own brothers, 3,000 dead in a single day. This is not discipline, this is divine tyranny. In Deuteronomy, Yahweh commands the genocide of the Canaanites, not for their crimes, but simply because they live on land he wants for his chosen people. Show them no mercy, he orders. Women, children, infants, all are to be put to the sword. This is not holy war, this is ethnic cleansing, sanctioned by a God who revels in bloodshed. Even his own people are not spared. When David takes a census, Yahweh kills 70,000 with a plague. When Saul spares a single Amalekite king, Yahweh strips him of his throne. But when David commits adultery and murder, a slap on the wrist. Yahweh's morality is not just, it is arbitrary, favoring those he likes and destroying those he doesn't, regardless of their actions. The prophets only deepen the horror. Isaiah describes Yahweh as one who creates evil, Isaiah 45:7. Ezekiel depicts him as a jealous husband who brutalizes his unfaithful wife. Hosea shows him ordering a prophet to marry a prostitute as a metaphor for Israel's shame. This is not love, this is divine abuse. And in Job, Yahweh allows Satan to torture an innocent man, killing his children, destroying his wealth, and afflicting him with disease, all to win a bet. When Job dares to question him, Yahweh responds not with answers, but with threats, boasting of his power to crush Job like an insect. This is not wisdom, this is bullying. From start to finish, Yahweh is a God of fear, not love. A God who demands worship while acting like a tyrant. A God who punishes generations for the sins of their ancestors. A God who kills children to make a point. A God who hardens hearts so he can justify slaughter. If this is the biblical God, then the Bible is not a book of hope. It is a record of divine cruelty. And if we are to judge a being by his actions, then Yahweh is not good. He is not just. He is, by any moral standard, evil. Or that what we call God in the Old Testament is not the source of all being, but the shadow of it. The Demi Urgos, blind and convinced of his own divinity. The doubled nature of God has long since made appearance in spiritual psychology. In 1952, Carl Jung published what many consider his most controversial work, Answer to Job. In it, Jung dared to psychoanalyze God himself, revealing a divine psyche split between consciousness and shadow, wisdom and unconsciousness. What Jung discovered wasn't just a theological problem, it was a psychological revelation about the nature of the divine unconscious and its impact on human consciousness. Jung begins his analysis with a startling premise. God, as portrayed in the Book of Job, suffers from a split personality. On one hand, Yahweh claims omniscience and perfect justice. On the other, his behavior reveals profound unconsciousness, emotional instability, and moral contradiction. This isn't theological heresy, it's psychological observation applied to the most sacred of subjects. The Book of Job presents us with a God who makes a wager with Satan, using a righteous man as the stakes in a cosmic bet. Jung recognized this immediately as the behavior of an unconscious deity, one who acts impulsively without considering the moral implications of his actions. An omniscient God would know the outcome of such a test. An omnipotent God would need no proof of Job's loyalty. The very existence of the wager reveals divine unconsciousness. But Jung's insight goes deeper. He argues that Yahweh's treatment of Job represents a crucial moment in the evolution of divine consciousness. Through Job's questioning, through his refusal to accept easy answers, the human being becomes morally superior to God. This creates what Jung calls an unendurable situation, the created surpassing the creator in ethical development. Jung identifies in Yahweh what he terms antinomial consciousness, a psyche that contains opposite tendencies without integration. God is simultaneously loving and wrathful, just and arbitrary, protective and destructive. This isn't divine mystery, it's psychological splitting on a cosmic scale. Consider Yahweh's opening speech to Job from the whirlwind. Instead of answering Job's moral questions, God responds with a display of raw power. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? This deflection reveals profound psychological insecurity. A truly confident deity would engage with the moral questions directly. Instead, Yahweh retreats into omnipotence as defense, using power to avoid psychological vulnerability. Jung recognizes this pattern as characteristic of the undeveloped psyche, the tendency to use strength to mask weakness, authority to avoid accountability. Yahweh's inability to acknowledge Job's legitimate moral concerns reveals not divine transcendence but psychological immaturity. The divine boasting about Behemoth and Leviathan, creatures of chaos that God alone can control, serves a crucial psychological function. Jung sees these monsters as representations of God's own shadow, the chaotic, destructive aspects of the divine psyche that remain unintegrated. By externalizing these forces as creatures he controls, Yahweh avoids confronting them as aspects of his own nature. Jung's most radical insight involves the relationship between divine unconsciousness and human consciousness. As humanity develops ethically and psychologically, it begins to surpass its creator in moral sophistication. Job represents this evolutionary leap, a human being who maintains ethical standards even when his God abandons them. This creates what Jung calls a compensatory relationship. The more unconscious God becomes, the more conscious humanity must become to maintain psychological balance. Job's suffering isn't meaningless. It's the price of human psychological evolution. Through enduring undeserved punishment while maintaining ethical integrity, Job demonstrates a moral development that his God lacks. The friends who visit Job represent conventional religious consciousness, the attempt to rationalize divine behavior through theological systems. But Job refuses these consolations. His insistence that he is innocent despite God's punishment represents a crucial psychological breakthrough, the recognition that divine behavior can be morally evaluated and found wanting. Jung sees this as a pivotal moment in human consciousness. For the first time, a human being holds God accountable to moral standards. This isn't rebellion, it's psychological maturation. The child has outgrown the parent and must now take responsibility for ethical development that the parent cannot provide. Jung's analysis reveals how omnipotence itself becomes a psychological pathology when divorced from consciousness. Yahweh's unlimited power, untempered by ethical reflection, becomes a source of cosmic suffering. The ability to do anything without restraint leads to actions that would be considered psychopathic if performed by humans. The God who permits Satan to torture Job, who destroys Job's family as collateral damage in a divine wager, exhibits what Jung recognizes as a fundamental disconnection between power and responsibility. This isn't divine justice, it's the arbitrary exercise of force by an unconscious will. Jung draws parallels to the human psyche when the shadow remains unintegrated. Just as individuals with unacknowledged shadow material often project their darkness onto others, Yahweh projects his own unconscious destructiveness onto Satan while maintaining the illusion of perfect goodness. The wager with Satan isn't a test of Job, it's God's unconscious collision with his own shadow. The restoration of Job's fortunes at the story's end, double possessions, new children to replace the dead ones, reveals the depth of divine unconsciousness. Yahweh treats human beings as replaceable objects rather than irreplaceable subjects. The psychological implications are staggering. A deity who cannot comprehend the irreversible nature of loss, the irreplaceable value of individual human lives. Jung's analysis doesn't end with Job's suffering. It extends to the psychological necessity of divine incarnation. Having been confronted with human moral superiority, God must undergo his own psychological development. The incarnation becomes not a theological doctrine, but a psychological imperative. God must become human to develop the consciousness he lacks. Christ represents what Jung calls the answer to Job, God's attempt to understand human experience from within, rather than from the position of omnipotent detachment. But even this answer reveals the continuing split in divine consciousness. Christ embodies the loving, self-sacrificing aspect of God, while the Father remains the arbitrary, judgmental deity of the Hebrew Bible. The crucifixion becomes a moment of divine psychological crisis. God experiences, through his incarnated aspect, the suffering he has inflicted on Job and countless others. But Jung notes a crucial limitation. Christ's sinlessness prevents him from fully integrating the shadow. The incarnated God remains split between the perfect Son and the problematic Father. This leads Jung to his most controversial conclusion. The psychological evolution of God requires not just incarnation, but the integration of evil itself. The divine psyche must acknowledge and incorporate its shadow rather than projecting it onto Satan or humanity. Jung's concept of synchronicity, meaningful coincidence, emerges partly from his analysis of divine psychology in Job. The seemingly random timing of Job's afflictions, the coincidental arrival of his friends, the precise moment of divine intervention, all suggest a universe governed not by conscious design, but by unconscious psychological patterns. Yahweh's behavior exhibits what Jung recognizes as the acausal connectivity characteristic of unconscious processes. Events occur not through logical causation, but through psychological constellation, patterns that emerge from the unconscious depths of the divine psyche. This has profound implications for human experience. If God himself operates largely from unconscious processes, then human life unfolds within a universe governed by psychological rather than purely rational principles. Suffering isn't always meaningful in a moral sense, but it may be significant in a psychological sense, part of the unconscious patterns through which both divine and human consciousness evolve. Jung identifies a crucial gap in Yahweh's psychological makeup: the absence of integrated feminine consciousness. The Hebrew God is overwhelmingly masculine, focused on law, power, judgment, and control. The wisdom tradition, Sophia, exists but remains separated from the main divine personality. This psychological imbalance contributes to Yahweh's unconsciousness. Without integrated feminine qualities, receptivity, nurturing, intuitive wisdom, and relational consciousness, the divine psyche remains incomplete. The harsh treatment of Job reflects this masculine inflation, a god of pure logos without the tempering influence of eros. Jung sees the eventual elevation of Mary in Christian doctrine as a compensatory movement toward divine psychological wholeness. The assumption of the feminine into heaven represents the beginning of divine integration, the acknowledgement that consciousness requires both masculine and feminine principles working in harmony. But this integration remains incomplete in traditional theology. Mary's sinlessness, like Christ's, prevents full shadow integration. The divine feminine remains idealized rather than whole, pure rather than psychologically complete. Jung's analysis suggests that the psychological evolution of God continues through human consciousness. As humanity develops psychologically, it participates in the ongoing individuation of the divine psyche. Each person who integrates their shadow, who holds the tension of opposites without splitting, contributes to the healing of the cosmic psychological wound revealed in Job. This places enormous responsibility on human consciousness. We become not just creatures of God, but participants in God's psychological healing. The ethical development that Job demonstrated, maintaining integrity despite divine abandonment, becomes a template for humanity's role in cosmic psychological evolution. Jung sees modern psychological awareness as part of this evolutionary process. Depth psychology doesn't diminish the divine, it participates in divine self-understanding. By recognizing projection, integrating shadow material, and developing conscious relationship with the unconscious, humans contribute to the very process of divine individuation. Jung's late work on the Book of Revelation reveals the continuing split in divine consciousness. The apocalypse represents not divine justice, but the return of the repressed shadow in cosmic form. The God of Revelation exhibits even more extreme psychological splitting than the God of Job. Perfect love alternating with perfect wrath, no middle ground, no integration. The destruction of the world in Revelation reflects what happens when shadow material remains unintegrated for too long. It erupts with compensatory violence, seeking the balance that conscious integration might have achieved peacefully. The lake of fire, eternal torment, and cosmic destruction represent the shadow's revenge against centuries of repression. But Jung also sees hope in the apocalyptic vision. The New Jerusalem descends from heaven, a symbol of the sacred marriage between divine and human consciousness, masculine and feminine principles, spirit and matter. This represents the potential completion of the psychological process begun in Job, the full integration of divine consciousness. Jung's analysis of Job has profound implications for human psychological development. If God himself suffers from unconsciousness and shadow projection, then human beings cannot depend on divine consciousness for psychological healing. We must develop the very qualities that our God lacks: ethical reflection, shadow integration, and conscious relationship with the unconscious. This doesn't lead to atheism, but to psychological maturity. The God who tortures Job cannot be the final word on divine reality. There must be something beyond the anthropomorphic deity of the Hebrew Bible, a God who has achieved the integration that Yahweh lacks. Jung suggests that this integrated God emerges through human psychological development. As we learn to hold opposites in tension, to integrate shadow material without projecting it, to develop both masculine and feminine consciousness, we participate in the birth of a new divine image, one that reflects psychological wholeness rather than splitting. The therapeutic process becomes a form of sacred work. Each successful analysis, each integrated shadow, each healed projection contributes to the healing of the cosmic psychological wound. The individual's journey toward wholeness parallels and participates in the divine journey toward consciousness. Jung's answer to Job doesn't provide final answers, but opens ongoing questions. If divine consciousness evolves through human psychological development, then every generation must provide its own answer to Job. Each era must confront the split between divine claims and divine behavior, between religious ideals and psychological reality. Our contemporary answer might focus on the ecological shadow, a God who creates a world of interconnected life while humans, made in his image, destroy that interconnection. Or the technological shadow, divine creative power manifested through human innovation that threatens to surpass and potentially destroy its creators. The pattern remains consistent: apparent divine unconsciousness manifesting through human behavior, requiring conscious human response to restore psychological balance. We become the consciousness that our God lacks, the integration that our Creator needs, the answer to questions that the divine psyche poses through its unconscious actions.